Verti's this podcast disclaimer: the information presented in this podcast is for entertainment, informational, and educational purposes only. It is not intended as legal, professional, or financial advice and should not be construed as such. Content and topics shown or discussed may not be accurate nor up-to-date information. Laws and regulations change frequently and vary by location, jurisdiction, and by nation. You should consult with a qualified legal or financial professional for advice specific to your situation. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not reflect the views of the podcast as a whole. The host is not responsible for any errors or omissions in the information provided or for any actions taken based on the content of this podcast. We are not liable for any losses, damages, or consequences arising from the use of this information. By listening to this podcast, you agree to hold the host and any guests harmless from any decisions you make, or from any losses, damages, or other claims arising from your use of this information.
All right, we're back. Okay, so this episode, we're going to be talking, circling back to talking about collectibles, obviously Magic the Gathering. I'm going to pass it over to you, to talk more about our recent experience at the Magic convention.
Yes, so I want to say we just came back, but it's really been, 2 weeks now, I think, since we got back. But due to us not feeling the greatest, kind of had to take a little bit of a delay on doing this podcast about this event. Event was great. We've been to this event. This would be our second time going in the last 2 years. So we have kind of had an idea of what we're heading into. For those that haven't been to a convention before, basically it's a giant hall, giant cargo gymnasium. I don't know how you would hangar basically of space, which is filled up with all the stuff that's related to the convention. In our case, it's Magic the Gathering, our trading card game that we've been playing and still playing for the last 6-7 years, I guess. And so, yeah, we basically planned a trip with a couple of other buddies to head down there and first and foremost to enjoy the Magic Gathering community, and then second of all to play some Magic, and then third to sell some Magic. So yeah, I'll let you talk a little bit about our whole thought process of how we started to kind of formulate this.
Yeah. But just to circle back to your explaining how big it was, I think for anyone that hasn't gone to those Vegas style convention halls, they're like potentially like multi Costco size. A lot of people have been in Costco, right? So that's pretty popular around the world. One Costco is not necessarily the size of the hall. It could be multi Costco size in length.
And two levels too.
Yeah, so it's big. Process. So I think in our prior Magic the Gathering episode, we were talking about collectibles, and one of the things that we got into, I think it was back in 2017, actually, approximately.
Yeah.
Obviously it's a trading card game, very popular, and with anything popular with a community behind it and has a collectability, there's often a secondary market, right, where people will buy and sell, trade the cards that they want or need or desire, right? For this time around, because the first time we went about, I think, a year ago, we noticed that there was a lot of vendors, and I think you yourself, you had some experience with selling some cards at that point. So that was, I think, your first foray into that space, and I think overall that was successful. You had a good experience, and it made sense, right? And this time around, I think what the discussions we had was, well, we're going back, right? There is an opportunity for us to, potentially sell some of our cards that we have sitting around that we've collected over the years, simply aren't being used. It's one thing to have a bunch of cardboard cards lying around in your house, but it does take up space. And if you're not actively using it, it does beg the question, should you have something of potential value sit there and not do anything with it? Some people choose to keep it. That's okay too. But for myself, and I think with yourself as well, there was a degree of, well, we have this much, it would make sense to potentially liquidate a part of it and put those funds to a better use, or different use at least, right?
That's true. I mean, the first experience I had as well too was a little bit nerve-wracking, because it was an experience in terms of dealing with selling cards the first time that we went. So that led to us starting to sit down and kind of brainstorm a little bit about how we should plan out our our whole setup of doing it this time, which would make me personally feel more comfortable doing it as well.
I think the first time you did it was like a little bit more ad hoc. Like you had a bunch of cards, and you went to the vendor not really knowing what to expect. And then I think from what I saw and what you explained to me as well is They had a mat, and then they would put the cards in on certain piles. The mat, some of them have mats where they're like designated like monetary value, like this card's worth 25
Yeah.
cents, and they'll stack it all there if it's worth 25 cents, so on and so forth. Excuse me one second.
So it is quite nerve wracking because not only do you have to look at what the person is placing those amounts, what they deem the value of the cards as,
Mhm.
but you also internally have to know if they're doing
Right,
it correctly and if it's worth your while to
right,
sell that card at that price. Because if you're
right,
not sure what the value of your cards are, going in there, they may view something that's maybe say you think it's $10, but they could be like, oh, we only want to buy it for two. You
right.
may want to take that back. But if
Exactly.
you don't know at that instant that that's where your value of your cards are, you may lose out on and not wanting to challenge
Right, right.
uh that deal, right? That particular deal. But we're talking about hundreds of cards being sold at a time, right? I mean, and for many others, it's thousands of cards at a time
Sure,
too.
yeah. Collections. And it's not
Exactly.
like we're saying, oh, the vendor's out to get you. No, like a lot of times it's the onus is on the seller, right? Like if you don't know the value of what you're selling, then that's your fault, right? You
Yeah,
can't blame
that's right.
someone who's buying it to know the value and you not knowing what it is when you sell it. So you're right. Like from a first time experience, it is in a sense. I mean, it's not nerve wracking, but it's that sense of preparedness or lack of preparedness, right? If you
Yeah.
know the card value inside and out, you can easily tell whether the value being offered makes sense. But if you have some cards where you didn't look up ahead of time what it's worth and you just like included it for the sale, you'll most likely go with whatever the buyer offers, right? You
Yeah.
wouldn't know how to counter, right? So there's a bit of all that. So I think this time around we talked it through and we're like, well, how should we approach it, right? And one of the things I think we arrived at was, well, let's do some recon, right? Do some proof of
Yeah.
work.
Well,
Um,
although I
mhm,
think the first thing was let's
yep.
make a list of what
Oh,
we want to
sure.
sell.
Yeah.
Because I felt I was blindsided the first time I went, and it's totally my
Right.
fault, not knowing what I had of value. I mean, I had some idea, but prices change, and and you
Hmm.
just too much stuff going on
Absolutely.
when you're at a convention of that size.
Yes.
And so I think the first thing we nailed down was, okay, what are we selling, and how much are we looking to get from it?
Right.
That was
Right.
the first part,
Yes,
right?
you're right.
Yeah,
You're
was it
right.
the same for you?
Yes, that's correct. I think it was your idea first, and then that spurred me to start putting together basically a spreadsheet. Right, we started
Right,
approaching
we
it
did
from that
spreadsheets.
angle,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then
it's work.
we did a whole bunch of looking it up manually too. I think initially, like
Oh,
I think
yeah.
we were going on to various vendor websites, right, like Card Kingdom or TCG Market or whatever, just to kind of look at what the value is for each card. We were like typing them in manually with the search,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then filling it all out, right, and I think for myself, I had at that point maybe, I don't know, like probably maybe close to 100 cards approximately that I wanted to
Yeah.
sell. And I was like, okay, that's good enough because it's just so much work, right?
Most
Um,
tiring.
it is. And then it
Yeah.
got to a point where we started talking more about, what to expect, or if we were the buyer, what would we be thinking, or what was the process like a year ago? Try to kind of brainstorm, rethink how to make the process go smoother, what to expect. And then, but we still had a lot of questions. And so I think
Yeah.
that's where we decided, hey, it would make sense to do a little bit of recon.
Mhm.
And then I think I fished out like the vendor list that Wizards of the Coast or WotC or basically MagicCon provides on their website, which was very
Yes.
useful because once I had that, I went to the web page, looked at all the vendors, and they had like
Yeah.
featured vendors, right? And all alphabetical, whatever. So then me and you had a discussion, and it got to a point where we're like, I think you brought up maybe emailing them, and I thought about that, but
Yeah.
then we in our minds,
Well,
we had more.
I said that not knowing that a lot of the vendors don't just come from the United States, right?
Yes, that too.
I thought most of the vendors were from the United States, but actually turns out a lot of them are all over the world,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So that was also another thing that you don't really know about until like you did some research into it.
right.
And it led us to know that okay, maybe emailing them is not the best idea because we don't know the time zones.
Hmm.
We knew that for a fact that it was a lot of um transportation logistics for these companies to
Mm-hmm.
get there.
Mm-hmm.
And we're already talking about, we're about 2 weeks out from the convention,
Yeah.
and they're like madly putting together all their stock and
Prep.
inventory, getting
Yeah.
ready to ship things out. Like
Yeah.
this process is massive, right?
Huge.
Like in my eyes,
Yeah.
it's massive operation,
Yeah.
and for them to nail it, to do it, it's a feat on its own.
Yeah. And I think timing wise, we lucked out, right? So we basically thought about, like, we ended up we thought email might be a good start, but then the more we talked about it, the more questions we had, and I started
Yeah.
to realize that, well, if we do email, then we'd have like so many questions, and that's not really effective because, for one, we don't know how fast a particular vendor will reply back to you, or if they even will, right? So then
Yeah.
I got to the point where I said, hey, how about I try making some calls, right? That's pretty easy because
Yeah.
all the vendors, most of them have websites, and then that's where I started. Oh, let me give it a shot. And so I started going down the list. And to your point, I started to realize that, yeah, like some of these vendors, when you start looking at the website, you realize that their phone number is like in Italy or something. And you're like, well,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna call long distance. I mean, I could, but
Yeah.
sometimes language could be a barrier. I can't expect them to know English for sure, right? And
Yeah,
so I
yeah.
thought it might make more sense to hit all the ones that are in North America, for example. It might be a little bit easier.
Yeah.
So then I went with that approach. And then as I called them, we brainstormed a set of questions that we wanted to ask or get answered, which helped.
Mhm.
So that when I called, I knew what to ask for. And then also, you in parallel, you sent emails to the ones that we couldn't get a phone number to. That could be some of the
Right.
ones that are like, European or from other parts of the world, right? And that helped as
Yeah.
well. But from my experience of calling them, I think a lot of them were quite genuine and helpful. And
Right.
they were to the point, right? There wasn't any shady stuff or anything like that. If they didn't know, they simply tell you straight up, I'm not too sure, or the person that knows isn't around. Okay, that's fine. A lot of them would
Mhm.
recommend, the advice they gave us was like, hey, if you've got a list, please send it to us in email so that we can give you a quote. And I was like, hey,
Yeah.
that's cool, right? Because we already had a list. We just didn't know
Right.
whether they would bother to look at it. And so I asked various questions like, oh, if we have a list, would you be interested, or would you be able to give us a quote? A lot of them did say, yeah, sure. Send it over. We'll do our best. But, keep in mind, this was like maybe a week and a half before the convention. So as you said, they were already like packing and busy with the stuff to ship and get themselves ready and all the booth stuff, right? So,
Yeah.
but either way, like I think quite a few of them, at least a handful, 3 or 4, got back
Do you
to
remember
us.
some of the questions? Do you remember
Oh,
some of the questions that you had asked them?
yes. So, one of the things there's a few questions actually. One of the ones were what would help them, right? Because if we've got a bunch of cards,
Yeah.
we can send them the list ahead of time. That's one thing. But what
Right.
would also help them if we're there in person? They recommended things like, hey, if there are cards that specific vendors are looking for, it is worthwhile to check their buy list, which each vendor has their own buy list posted up usually. And you can look at,
Yeah.
what they're willing to pay a little bit more for. Now, when we say more, that doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna make like top dollar. That's not how it works. Is the way with, at least for Magic, when you sell something back out, chances are you're not going to get dollar for dollar value. Most vendors, usually depending on the value of the card or popularity or the demand for that particular card or rarity, they may offer slightly better. It could be 70 cents to the dollar. But whereas for cards where it's not sought after, or maybe it's very there's more
Oh,
bulk.
can I stop you
Oh,
for 1 second? Sorry
sure.
about that. Let me just explain to some of the listeners in case they don't understand the lingo, because why we talk about to the dollar is because the cards are worth a certain money value. They're not literally worth $1. They may be worth, $70, $80, $5, depending on what the value of the card is. But we break that down to what percentage you can get back out of the card. So when we're talking about it during this podcast, a lot of the times when we reference 70 cents to the dollar, basically for every dollar that is valued in the market, we're only getting 70% of that back. So that's why we say 70 cents, because it
Mhm.
just makes sense to us when we're dealing with the vendor
Right.
what amount of value we're getting back,
Yeah.
just so that everyone can understand that we're on what type of jargon we're
Scale.
using in terms
Yeah.
of like valuing the
Absolutely.
cards. Sorry, go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
makes sense. No, I think that's very helpful. Um, and I think from talking to other friends that have sold in the past, through their experience, the advice was, at best expect, worst case could be maybe 40 cents to the dollar or 40% back, right? And that's when it really kind of hit me, at least. I'm like, wow, like the amount of money that I've spent on a hobby. I mean, a lot of hobbies you don't even get any return value, right? But for this one, even though it's so popular, to think that you can only get 40 cents back for every dollar that you put in potentially, it seems like quite low, right? But at the same time, like one of the things that the from a vendor's perspective or the buyer's perspective is, they're buying that and they have to keep it in the inventory, and they don't know if it's going to sell right away, right? And so obviously the lower the demand for a card, they're going to offer less because it's going to move slower. And they're obviously going to factor in that they need to make profit. So when they resell it, they're going to have to, factor in their costs and then resell it at a reasonable value, right? It might be at the market price. And that market price will fluctuate. So just because they bought something for, say, 40 cents to a dollar, it doesn't necessarily mean that when they sell it, they'll get back their 40 cents that they paid for it. If it was a dollar worth, right? It could have dropped because the market fluctuates a little bit, right? To some degree.
And to that, our hope is, I mean, as of any investor or of this hobby, or any hobbies, you're looking to hopefully maybe your cards have gone up in value over time. So something that maybe if you bought for $1 has now become $2, selling it for 70 cents to the dollar, getting 70% of that value back is not too bad, because your card has gone up in value. So maybe all said and done, you've probably only lost maybe 10% of the value.
Sure.
If that's the best case scenario, right? I mean, obviously you might hit the lottery on some of the cards. They've gone up tenfold.
Sure.
And of course, no matter what they give you to the dollar, you're going to be making money. Then of course, everyone would be happy about that as a seller, right? But just to kind of add a little bit more of the why
perspective.
this is such a it's a wide range. Like
Yes.
it's not that the value of the cards don't go up, they do. And we'll probably get into that a little bit later, which is like why the cards go up in value and why they go down in value. And so that all factors in during this whole conversation that me and you are having about how to sell these cards and how much we should sell them for.
Right. And so the range, generally speaking, is for not so popular, about 40 cents to a dollar. If you're lucky, 70% is really good, right? Very rare would you find 80 to 90. That's almost unheard of. Not saying it's impossible, but that might be the buy list ones where they really need more of that card that's very popular and they're willing to pay more for it. Okay, but it likely won't be 1-to-1. That's what we're just trying to explain. And so in our preparation, we basically, in our spreadsheet, we basically factored, okay, if it was 40% value, what would be our total return value for all the cards that we have in our collection that we're selling? And then if it was 50%, 60%, 70%, that way we had an easier way to reference, like when we're sitting down and the buyer makes us an offer, the vendor, we'll right away know for that amount that they're offering, because they're not going to say per card. They're going to say all the cards you're selling, this is what we're offering in totality. So then that way we could easily look at, is that closer to the 70% or is that closer to the 40% range, right? Where does it fall? And it'll give us a better idea of whether things make sense or align with our expectations. Now, another thing to call out is it's not like all the cards that we're planning to sell are going to be the money cards or top dollar cards, right? A lot of the things that we sell probably are in like the lower end where there's not as much demand. We have a lot of extra, right? It's probably only a small subset, if we're realistic, maybe 10, 15, or maybe the top 20% of our cards that we're selling are considered like, wow, those ones have gone up maybe 1 or 2 multiples, depending on, the popularity, the rarity, so on and so forth. Most of the other cards fall within the range where, they're definitely nowhere near that high. A lot of them could be, I think the majority of maybe like good 30 to 40% of my collection was in the $1 to $5 range, right?
That's fair.
And then the mid range was somewhere between like $6 to $25 range, right? And then when we say like, higher end, that's like, okay, maybe it was 25 plus, but those are a lot less in total. So just kind of paint that picture. Going back to other questions we asked, when I'm calling up these vendors, I'm asking them, hey, I tell them, honest with them, I say, I've never done this before. What would help you? What should I expect? they basically say, hey, if you've got any cards that are sleeved or in binders, remove them, right? Because that takes up a lot of time because we have to like take them out of the binder. And if you have it like double sleeve, like, so there's a way to sleeve cards where you put on one sleeve that's a tighter fit, and then you put on a second sleeve that's slightly wider, and that's called double sleeving. And there's a benefit to that because that helps keep out air, dirt, or even in some cases a certain amount of water or humidity, which is great. It's great for, you know, when you're handling the cards, but when you're trying to sell and the buyer needs to be able to, they told us that they need to touch the texture, right? You have to feel that the card is real because there are fake cards out there, and they sure as hell don't want to be buying fake cards for whatever money value, right? So they have to be able to touch it, right? So I've seen people sniff it because the cards have a certain smell.
Hey, some of the older cardboard do smell different, so that is one of the I haven't seen anyone taste it yet, but I mean, the smelling part is pretty real.
Yeah, I mean, if they're tasting it, they're buying it. So yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's true.
there are differences too in card stock over time, and you're right, absolutely. Yes. And so they basically quite a few of them said, yeah, make sure they're not sleeved, so that saves time, because time saved means quicker in and out, right? You don't want to be sitting there, them going through your pile of who knows how many cards, 100 plus or more. Some folks had like entire sets of like literally 1,000 cards, right? And when it's like that, then the buyer is going to pick and choose. They're not going to spend all eternity looking at every single card. They're going to just look for the money cards and literally maybe just give you some flat value for the rest if you really want to sell the rest, or tell you to take it back, right? And they'll just focus on
I do want to say that I do want to say that they do offer, a lot of them do offer the service of you dropping off your cards to them,
right?
And that they will get it back to you at a later time during the convention, so that you don't have to sit around and wait, and you can enjoy the convention. But that, of course, does pose some
trust
risks, because I mean, all of the vendors that we've dealt with there, and I'm pretty sure they all are very reputable.
Agreed.
And I haven't heard any issues. Otherwise, I don't think they'd be invited there to be vendors anyways.
Right.
But it's just something that you are leaving behind, that hopefully, once again, we go through the same issue, which is, do they value the things that you think it's going to be valued at the price that you want it to sell at? What if there's some cards you would want to take back? You have to really be able to be like, you know what, I don't really care for all this stuff I'm leaving behind. I'll get whatever you'll pay me. Then it's fine that you leave that behind. But I think for some of us, as we learn more about this process, we kind of want to make sure we get the most that we can out of the cards that we own. And I think this goes along with a lot of different collectibles too.
Yes, absolutely. Circling back to now I've got the list of questions that we actually built. I can give a better idea. Obviously we talked about percentage return, right? The percentage, like cents on the dollar. Right. We also asked about, is there any minimum value that they just don't bother with? Because we've been told by other friends, like, hey, if you've got like a 5-cent card, don't bother, right? You're wasting their time, you're wasting yours. And that makes a lot of sense. And so a lot of them were really like, you know, like some of them, I think a few of them told us, no, not there's no real minimum value that they wouldn't entertain. It's just that when it gets to a certain value, they'll just offer a flat amount. Like it'd be like, oh, we'll take this whole stack of like unwanted cards for like maybe a few dollars. You know, do you want to take it or leave it? Right? That's up to you. So that makes sense, right? So they don't have to waste their time looking at every, you know, bulk card, common card, so to speak. Other things were, you know, like we mentioned earlier, you know, do they take a sale list? So if we compiled a list ahead of time, would they be interested in looking at it? Would that help them? And then, you know, I think most of them were like, yeah, if you've got it, send it over, right? And then out of I think the handful that we sent it to, I think at least 2 or 3 of them came back with a quote, which was really nice. Because then that helped us decide which vendor would we most likely want to go with. Because without even having to be there in person, obviously it's subject to the condition of our cards, and really the list is what we bring. But if that matched up, like they're basically saying we think that these cards would be worth this much, or we'd be willing to pay this much for the for your list of cards that you're selling. So then that gives us in advance an idea of which vendor would be worth our time to go to. Because at a convention, I think what we have to stress is we're not trying to lowball the vendors here or highball them. What we're
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
do is we're trying to make effective use of our time. It's like, for one thing, when we go to convention, we don't want to spend all day going to each vendor just to have them look through the cards and then tell us that, oh, this is not, we're not going to offer this value that you're looking for. Well, then we've wasted both parties' time, right? And now I don't
Oh,
get to spend my time walking around. Go ahead.
and I want to say, it's going to a convention like this. There's a lot of people there, obviously, because they are very large locations that they're hosting these at, and there's a lineup going to get your passes. There's a lineup getting into the lineup that goes into the convention. So there are several lines before actually getting to the vendor. And
Right.
then when you get to the vendor, you're not the only one selling to them. There's a
Mhm.
lineup to sell to the vendor. I
Yeah.
think all in all, I could say quite honestly, we spent maybe 2 to 3 hours
In
straight
lineups.
just lining up,
Yeah.
just getting ready to get to the vendor to see somebody. And
Mhm.
so that's all the time would be,
To
if
do
you went,
something
like you
else.
said, if you go to other vendors, you're going to be adding more hours.
Yeah.
I think the average wait time, especially for the first day,
Yeah.
is about an hour wait time to get to your turn.
Yeah.
Now, there are some companies that do offer appointments,
Sure.
but once again, are you gonna, sell to that one? You don't know yet until you
Right.
get there and they price it out for you. There's a lot of things that factor in.
Mhm.
And one of our worries were, when we talked about this, was, okay, we know that when we go there, obviously we want to get, this is a big mission, big quest for us to get this done. Now, if we didn't get it done right away, we felt that there was a risk that the prices would tend to drop, because the more popular cards might be already filling up their inventory. This is our theory, right? Not proven, right? I don't
Mhm.
think at the end it actually happened, but it was a decent theory. I mean, if you were a store owner and you had no copies of this card, then by the end of day one, um, you had 100 copies. You might not want to take any more copies in, right?
Absolutely.
And so you might not offer, the same price you did for the first 100 cards. I mean, it makes sense to me. If I was the buyer, I would
Right.
do that. I would change the price on it.
Right.
So to us, there was some urgency to get this done relatively quickly, not knowing that whether we would get less just due to time decay of
Yeah.
of other people selling their
Sure.
cards.
Yeah, it is like a competition basically, right? If there's
Exactly.
oversupply, like you said, then the demand is going to drop, which is the buyers willing to buy how many.
In theory.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we have to factor that in.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a little bit of game theory to that, I guess. Um,
Mhm.
again, so I guess again, let's just finish off what other
Sorry.
questions we
Yeah.
have.
I
No,
keep
that's
interrupting.
okay. I
Yeah.
think
Keep going. Yeah.
those are good points. We're gonna talk more about our experience in those lineups and stuff.
Yeah.
One of the other questions we asked was, like on the top of my mind was, um, if I'm gonna liquidate my cards, I could potentially, get back a wad of cash, right, in bills.
Mhm.
That's the easiest. But at the same time, like I don't know, I have no control over what type of bills the vendor is gonna give me, right?
Yeah.
If they decide to give me a whole bunch of fives, what am I gonna do? Say no?
Yeah.
So that doesn't, so I had to kind of prepare for the worst. And at the same time, I'm thinking I don't really want to be carrying a whole wad of cash. It doesn't matter what amount. I simply just
Yeah.
don't want to carry a bulk of cash around me, because when other people look at you from afar, if you've got a whole wad, they're gonna think, wow, that's a lot of money, when in fact it could be a bunch of
Yeah.
fives, right? So you don't want to
Yeah.
give that misconception, no matter where you are, whipping out a whole wad of cash. I mean, in theory, in Vegas, there's a lot of people with wads of cash, but that's side story, right? So
Yeah.
one of the
Yeah.
things I asked the vendors was, and as a gauge to see how popular Bitcoin is, I said, I basically asked them, hey, do you pay out in Bitcoin by any chance, or is it just cash?
Yeah.
And I think of maybe the 10 or 12 vendors that we hit up, I think really only one of them replied back saying, or on the phone call that I made, that they said, yeah, we do.
Mhm.
I think Bitcoin for sure. They probably mentioned maybe some others, secondary popular altcoins, which is
Right.
fair. But basically they disclosed that, from a so-called cryptocurrency value wise, they probably
Yeah.
only have about like maybe $10,000 worth. So
Right.
and I guess the impression that they gave me was that's not the bulk of their change, so to speak, right? Like
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot of these vendors, they come prepared with a lot of cash because they expect cash exchanges. There
Yep.
are ones where if the cash value is too high, like there's people bring their whole collection and they have all these like, really limited rare cards from ages ago, and those might be like, one card could be, I don't know, how much is a Black Lotus? Like,
Anywhere from 30,000 to
right.
some in really good qualities, hundreds of thousands.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's no way you're gonna be lugging around as a vendor $100,000 in $100 bills and then hand you a suitcase. Like it doesn't make, there might not be a suitcase, maybe a couple stacks, right? But still, it doesn't make any sense. So under those circumstances, they'll tell you like, hey, we can give you a like a check, right?
Yes.
And you'd have to.
That's also something new that I didn't know about as well. Is that
Yeah.
that was an alternative payment method.
Right.
But there's risk in that as well, because
Yes.
there's issues with checks is if they were written incorrectly.
Sure.
Not this. Once again, nothing against the
No.
the vendors.
Yeah.
It's just that if the check was unclear, written incorrectly, for someone like ourselves, which were flying in from somewhere else,
Right.
there's very hard for you to go and argue about that check when
Yeah.
you're not in the country anymore.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And same with the vendors. These vendors are not native to the United States. They
Right.
could be, some of them are, some of them aren't. Right.
Right.
How are you going to go to someone, let's say, that are in Italy? Are you going to fly to Italy
And argue with them.
to deal with that check that was written out? I mean,
Right.
hopefully you can cash it right away in a couple of days that you're there. Right.
But that's doubtful, right? Because the thing with checks, and I don't know, for folks that aren't experienced with dealing with banks, is the assumption here is that if you share the same bank with the vendor, the buyer, sure, that would be relatively easier. That's probably still a 3 to 5 business day wait. But when it's between banks that are not common, especially if they're 2 different countries and they're 2 different banks.
So I
Go
think
ahead.
the idea is that people that take the checks in the United States,
Yeah.
they also have bank accounts in the United States. Their banking system might be slightly different than what we're used to.
Okay.
Because in the United States they actually have hundreds of different banks. So there is actually very low probability that you're going to have the same bank as the vendor does.
Okay.
The assumption is that the banks within the United States, this once again my guess,
Mhm.
is that they're able to verify the check between banks a lot quicker than what we're used to.
Okay.
But
Okay.
from where
we're from.
we are from,
Yeah.
that's not the case. It
Gotcha.
takes
It's
anywhere
a long
from
time.
a
Well,
week to up to a month to verify something
Yeah.
that's international, right?
And-
So yeah,
Right. And my point was like, let's say if you're from the States and or you're from Europe and you got a check from a USA vendor, it has to go from their USA bank to the European bank, and you'd have to hope that it's an international bank. But if it's not, a lot of chances are it may not be. It has to
That's
then
correct.
be rerouted to your local bank to confirm, whether they'll have to confirm with each other that, hey, do you have the funds to send over? And yes, is this a real account? And do all the, KYC special stuff. And before you even see the money, and as you said, yeah, it could literally be a month or more before it shows up. And that's
Yeah.
after potential any other fees that are on top.
Of course. Yeah.
So hence
Always the
that's
case.
yeah. And hence that's why for myself, right, I was interested in at least asking the question, because these days, Bitcoin is becoming more popular. So there's a chance that, the vendor may offer that. And so it turns out one of them did, and they were kind enough to share that, they don't have a lot of it because most of it is still cash. And so, they have about maybe 10,000. And I think from what we surmised is once that runs out, it's out, right? But I also asked them, like, do they do those type of Bitcoin related sales often? And they were honest and they said, actually not that often. Like we do have it available, but they couldn't really recall when the last time they made a payment. So that to me kind of indicated a different type of risk, right? Let's say, for example, I went to the vendor. I liked what they're offering in terms of value on the cards, and I wanted to make that transaction. And I'm like, hey, you know what? Maybe you can give me let's do the transaction in Bitcoin. My worry would be like if they don't do it often, they send it to an address, they mess up and they sent it, but I didn't get it because that's not my address, right? So there's that another level of concern. And so kind of debated that a little bit. I'm like, really, at the end of the day, it's kind of like as much and as novel as I'd like, and as liquid and quick as Bitcoin is, there's still that factor where if the parties aren't familiar with the technology, you could run into that aspect of it. So I think at the
Totally.
end, to kind of reason it up, like, you know what, cash is fine, right? Like it's not it wasn't a huge amount, so it's not really worth that extra level of risk or hassle. Yeah.
It was definitely. I also wanted to see the technology in action as well too. I mean, we
Of
know how
course.
the process works. We've done it amongst ourselves, but to actually do it in a transaction also signifies, to me anyways, it makes me feel like, oh, this is the technology in action, right?
Right.
And that
Right.
says a lot of things about, just confirmation, self-confirmation, right? We know
Sure.
it works. I mean, if it didn't, there would have been people would have been raising the flags a lot sooner than we would be. But the
Absolutely.
fact that you actually see it happen
Yeah.
is a whole different thing.
Yes.
To me, it's a milestone, a personal milestone that, hey, I did a transaction with someone I didn't know,
Yeah.
and it was to seal a deal that was a business transaction.
Yeah.
Really, that's what it is, right? A
Yeah.
buying and selling of two people
Yes.
coming together,
Yeah.
and that to me is like different than hearing about it
Yeah,
from
exactly. Second hand and or third
another source.
hand. Right.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
I mean, the next best thing you can do is watch a YouTube video where people are like doing, lightning or maybe like on-chain
Right.
transactions. Great. But that's watching a video, right? When you actually do it in person, that's where it really sinks in as, wow, this feels real. And to your
Exactly.
point, a lot of people often say, oh, or they argue that Bitcoin's not a medium of exchange. I mean, I don't think that's accurate. I would say Bitcoin definitely has the capability to be a medium of exchange. You can definitely
Yeah.
do it anytime. Is it a popular medium of exchange? Then I would agree it's not that popular, right? Depending on where you are, depending on the vendor and their know-how and capability, it can be very popular, but it's not there yet in popularity. But without a doubt, the technology is a medium of exchange. That's how I see
Right.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Mhm.
it has. It's basically that's where the roots of it grew up from too, right? Which is like, how do you transfer wealth? But I think more and more as we talk about it, it's like larger sums of money is probably better use than small little bits, unless
Exactly.
you're using other
Yeah.
things like lightning and things like that to help with it.
Right.
It's not going to be worth your while to just transfer $1 over
Right.
the chain. It's just
Yeah.
not technically worth. It's not feasible to do so.
Yeah, exactly. And then from talking to this particular vendor, it wasn't clear to me they understood the difference between lightning
Right.
and on chain. And that right away signaled the risk flag. Like, if I have to teach them how to do it, which isn't a problem. But the thing is, as a vendor, like, why would they trust me to teach them? Right? Like, who are you? You're a stranger
Yeah.
trying to sell me stuff. So how do I know you're not rugging me? Right? Like from a buyer
Yeah.
perspective, right? So obviously, I don't think they would be against it, but at the same time, I don't think both parties would feel comfortable being put into a position where one is teaching the other when there's a conflict of interest. So it's best not,
Yeah.
right? That would make the most sense. And then the other thing that we asked was, hey, like what did they use as a gauge for market value? And so there's a very popular website called TCG, or Trading Card Game Market, the TCG
Yep.
market.
TCG. I think.
Yeah,
I think. What does it stand for? TCG.
yeah, I think it's like something like that. I think it's Trading Card Game or something like that. And basically
Trading card game. Yeah.
Trading Card Game,
That's right.
perfect. And so it's TCG Market. That's the website, and you go to it, and they do a whole bunch of different trading card games, not just Magic. They do like Pokemon or whatever you name it, Yu-Gi-Oh, right? And then
Yep.
people basically use it as like a hub to basically offer, buy, sell, trade cards, and they'll list prices. And so what the vendor is saying is, when they price these, they will use the TCG Market website to look at the value of the card. Now, here's the thing. When you go to that website, the website will indicate three ranges of values, right? Low, I think it's like TCG low, meaning the TCG website's lowest value for the card, mid or medium or mid range, and high,
Yep.
right? And so
Yep.
the vendors basically said that they will use TCG low, meaning they'll use the lowest market value to value your card. So, for example, you take a card, the card's worth $10 on multiple
On the market.
on the market or multiple other vendor
Oh, right. Listed
websites,
price. Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Say
Yeah.
other places, and then but when you go to
Yeah.
TCG, TCG will very much have that range. They'll say low. Your so-called $10 card is considered, that would be the high range. Mid would
Yeah.
probably be 8, and low would probably be around 6. So what the vendor is telling you is, no matter how much your card is worth, they're always going to take the lowest range as the starting point,
Yeah.
and then it'll be
And give you. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
and
Yeah.
then it'll be 40 or 50 or 60%
Exactly.
of that low value, right? So
Yeah.
that is a dynamic that a lot of people don't know, and I definitely did not know. And that is a reminder that, again, with any collectible or anything that's tradable or whatnot, when you're selling it back out, and again, Magic's quite liquid in the sense that there's a large community, right? Unless you're doing a peer-to-peer type of buy sell trade, your value is definitely not going to be the same when you compare it to buy sell trade from a vendor. Right?
That's right.
So yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean that you totally said it. What I wanted to say was basically it was TCG low, the lowest price that was listed out there, and then a percentage on there as well too. And I think that really just kind of brings us down to, I think those are all the questions that we had wanted to ask,
Yeah.
right?
Do you want
I
to
wanted to
talk
share,
more? Yeah, you go ahead.
yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about the emails that kind of came back and what kind of responses I got, because I was also asking the same questions, which were like,
Right.
basically some of the things that you were asking, but like in more in written format, so that people can take their times to reply. And I must say, everyone was, I think most of the people responded back to that I sent out emails to, which is great. I mean, something like that is pretty good customer service from that point of view.
Absolutely.
But some of the responses were kind of interesting. Some of them were, a lot of them were saying like they would not really want to give me a price range of what they would be buying at. They would want to sit down in person and see me and kind of go like that, which is fine. That's pretty normal. Some of them would tell me, why don't you just go use our website? Our website has the capabilities of showing you what they buy the card at, and that will give you an idea. Great. I'm glad they have a website for that, but sometimes you kind of want to have a better understanding of when you're selling more than just one card at a time.
Right. Right.
And those websites, if that was the case, I wouldn't need to bring my cards to the convention. I would just send them over mail, and hopefully they get it, and then just sell it that way. So that wasn't exactly what I was really looking for a response either. Although they were very nice in answering all the other questions I have. The one
Absolutely.
strange one that I got was, we don't offer a price because we don't want you to go and shop our price around to our competitors. And sorry, excuse me,
And
that is a
yeah.
bit it's a bit odd for me,
Yeah.
because knowing that it's a marketplace,
Yeah.
knowing that prices are listed out there,
Hmm. Hmm.
what you're really saying to me is that we know your time is valuable. We know you're not going to line up at multiple vendors. So therefore, we're hoping that you come to us and then that's it. If that is indeed the case.
But that
I mean,
it
yeah,
comes off very negative though. Like
it does. It does.
the way I see it is it's not expedient, right? You want buyer and seller to have a smooth transaction. And so
Yeah.
time is the common currency, right? I don't waste your
Yeah.
time, you don't waste my time, right? Now it's okay. Like I understand if they say, hey, sorry, we don't give quotes. That's cool, right? But for
Yeah.
them to say, yeah, we don't give you a quote because we don't want you to shop around. What does that mean? Like it's
Yeah.
almost like you don't even want me to come to you in person because you don't even want to bother, right? Like,
Yeah. It does come across that way. Yeah.
so yeah. Sorry, keep going.
No, and then that was just one of the very interesting feedbacks that we got back. And I think, without disclosing, too much information, because prices wise they vary a lot from time to time and vendor to vendor. It's not really fair to say like this one offered me more than another. But I think ultimately, the one that was the most transparent to us and we felt was most upfront about the information, we decided to settle with, right? And I do want to give a quick shout out, not sponsored by them at all, but we thought that we had good experience. They were very professional, which was Card Monster Games.
Mm-hmm.
Card Monsters Games is actually located in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the United States. So they had to fly a good distance from where they were to Las Vegas, where the
Right.
convention was held.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, just want to, if this ever gets back to them, I mean, their staff was very friendly,
Oh, absolutely.
very approachable.
Yeah.
And we just had a really good experience with the whole process with them.
Yeah. I want to talk more about our experience from lining up at Card
Mm,
Monster, which we'll call CM Games, right? But it's Card Monster. But
yeah.
before we jump to that, the one thing I want to also call out is we, as I mentioned earlier, we started off manually creating a list, and I
Yeah.
maxed out at
That's
about
right.
100. I gave up. I was like, I'm so tired, right? Like I had to type it in manually, everything. And then there was a common friend that mentioned that, hey, because I think you were asking around, is there something like an app? Because I knew there was an app, I just didn't know which one was good. I think there's more than one. And then there was one friend that said, oh, they use Mana Box, right?
Right.
And then you started using it, and you're like, wow, this thing is amazing. And I'm like, really? And at that point, I already finished my list, so I was kind
Oh
of
yeah, me too.
really right. I was really like, do I want to bother? And then you convinced me. So then I went and downloaded ManaBox. It's free, right?
Yeah.
And it's a really good app.
Yeah.
We're not going to go into details about it, but the gist is, if the card recognition using your phone's camera is almost like, it takes, maybe if it's unsleeved and bare card, it's almost like really quick, like less than a second a lot of times.
Yeah.
If it's sleeved, like single sleeved, it can still do it, but it'll take a few more tries, right, because of depending on your lighting, whether there's
Yes.
glare.
Lighting's
um
important. Yeah.
but that's the amazing thing, is that with a sleeve on and sometimes there's glare, it can still pick up the card, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
goes to show, like, and one of the key things was that was a game changer for us, because it went from
Yeah.
100 cards, because not only does it take a picture, after it takes the picture or identifies the card, it tells you all the information about the card, as well as if you pick a certain website to pull data from, as in card value, it default. I think it automatically defaulted to TCG anyways. It showed what the value of that
Yeah.
card was on TCG. It may not be low, it probably mid or something like that, but at least it give you an idea how much the card was worth. And then you could then further narrow down which, because there can be multiple printings of the same card, different sets,
That's right.
same card. You could narrow it down to exactly which set matching the card number, so you know exactly what the value would be to expect. Now, it doesn't stop there. Once you scan your cards, or depending on how many you want to scan, you can then save it to a collection, and it retains it in your collection, so that you don't have to lose it. Like, it basically keeps the history for you. So once you're done scanning everything, you can then export it directly to a CSV file or a spreadsheet, whatever you prefer.
Yep. Hmm.
And then you have all of the information there, everything from the price, the card, what set, card number, so on and so forth. And that was the game changer, because we went from like maybe max 100, 150 cards to like, wow, now we were scanning every single thing we could get our hands on, because it just made everything so easy. We didn't have to type in anything. Everything was just automatically export after we have our collection. And another great thing is, once you have your collection on the app, when the prices change on a almost like hourly basis, it auto
Yeah.
reflects. You don't have to, it auto refreshes. You don't have to do anything. So while we were at the con, if I whipped it out, I could automatically see what the collection, what the price difference was. And it wasn't that huge. Maybe it moved around by a few dollars here and there, right?
Right.
But it does help, especially if you've got cards where maybe things are changing due to ruling, or sudden trends shifts or whatnot, or maybe at the convention they disclose something that, oh, at the convention or for a certain competition or tournament, a
Yeah.
certain card will be used. That could be a game changer. And the fact that you can see all that on your app on your phone, and it's free, wow, that was amazing. So at the end of all that, I basically paid for the app in terms of like disabling ads. I basically think it was totally well worth it. That was
Yeah.
my
Just to give
perspective.
them something back for the work
Yeah,
they put in.
absolutely.
Um, I wanted to add another thing as well too, because one of the things that the vendors told us about is they wanted the cards sorted in a certain way. They wanted it
Oh, right.
sorted alphabetically,
Hmm.
because I think it's easier for them to verify, and also for them to put into the inventory once they obtain your collection.
Right.
But for us as sellers, we tend to want to sort them by value, because we want to see all the money cards, making sure
Right.
that our cognitive abilities are fresh when we're
Mm-hmm.
in there sitting and negotiating, that we know that the best cards, the most valuable cards, are of the
Right.
values that we're looking for
Right.
before we get to the lesser value things. And that's not necessarily going to be in alphabetical order. One other aspect of um, mana box is that you can sort whatever way you want. So you could sort a list once it's in there by alphabetical and
Yes.
then pass it over, or you can sort it by money. So you know what cards are the money cards as well
Mm-hmm.
too before going into such a transaction. So these things are very powerful tools. Maybe you can put a link to where to download it. Once again,
Okay.
we're not sponsored by them,
No.
but they've been a very helpful tool in this whole process.
Yep.
Um, and I think it's valuable that other people have access to it as well.
Yeah, but in case I forget, right, folks, like the easiest way is to, if you're Android, go to the App Store, or if you're on Apple, go to the their App Store, and just search for ManaBox, and it's a free app, right? You don't gotta pay anything. Sure, it has some tiny ads, no big deal. But
Yeah.
you'll see right away that it's quite popular. There should only be one that's called ManaBox. So
Right.
yeah, that's
Right.
probably the best way, because like if I give a link, I'm not sure,
That's
like
true.
I might forget,
Might
and
go there or something
I don't
else.
want to disappoint, right? And it might be
Yeah.
the wrong one by accident. I don't want to be held accountable for misleading people either. But
Right.
yeah,
Right. That's true. Yeah.
yeah. Search for
um.
MANA and then box. I think to your point, I want to touch a little bit on that. So you're
Yep.
talking
Go ahead.
about the alphabetical for sure. And yes, we're more, because we're selling, we're more focused on making sure that for the money cards, so to speak, the higher value cards, $25 plus, we wanted to make sure
Hmm.
those got the focus and that we looked at those first. So through our discussion, we tried to think about it like, how would the buyer um expect it? Now we know from talking to the vendors on the phone and email that they prefer alphabetical, but again, that's to our disadvantage, because we then would have to pay attention to when they got to the money card, which would made no sense. So what me and
Yeah.
you ended up deciding on what to do was, we grouped them by dollar ranges, right? So if it was like 1 to 5,
Right.
that would be that group, and within that $1 to $5 group, we would
Yeah.
alphabetically list the cards, because to us we don't care, because we know that subset is 1 to 5. So our mind doesn't have to track every single card, right? And we always had
Hmm.
Mana Box on us as the app. We could look up that card anyways, so we didn't really have to worry too much. Did the same for the other tiers. So we had another tier, maybe potentially like maybe $6 to $15, right? I'm making it up. It's up to the
Yeah.
person. And then I had another one from like 16 to like $25, and then I had a
Yes.
final one where it's anything $26 plus. And then that way,
Right.
each of those subsets would be alphabetical, and then when we went to the vendor, we would give them the one that was the highest tier value wise, so that we can just watch that more closely. And then for the other
Hmm.
ones, we wouldn't be too worried, because those weren't really necessarily the so-called money cards, right? But they did add up. I think one of the things that ManaBox showed us was,
Yeah.
because I created those tiers in ManaBox and I scanned them
Yeah.
and said, oh, all the $1 to $5 cards go in this collection. I could see at the end, because I found so many cards I wanted to sell, that the $1 to $5 ones were like, because of the sheer quantity, they
Yes. That's
could
right.
compare to some of the mid-range subsets, and very rarely, but sometimes comparable. Like the mid-range could be comparable to the high range, which was, I wouldn't have known that without the app.
Yeah, yeah, it's very eye-opening to see where your value lies. Sometimes you're thinking these $1 or $2 cards aren't meaningful to sell, but as you group them up and the volume is there,
Mm-hmm.
the price reflects in that. More so, not more so, but it's very comparable amongst the categories. You actually do tend to have fewer cards in the higher end range, but they're worth more, right? And then, of course, as you move down the list, you have more and more volume, but it makes up for the lower value for each of the cards.
Yeah, and then it all adds up. Do
Hmm.
do you want to start talking about our experience from like lining up at Card Monster games?
Yeah. So
Yeah, you
so
go for it.
yep. Yeah. So as we were talking about before, it was a lineup the day before to get our passes to get ready to go to convention. We already thought ahead. Getting the passes a day early allows us to skip that line going into the official first day. Then, of course, when we got there that day, we were already, I think, half an hour early than the opening time. I think was it. I think it was like 10 o'clock, and we were there at 9:30, thinking to
Approximately.
ourselves, we were already early, this is going to save us some time already. We didn't want to go too crazy, right? But getting there, there was already a line forming outside to get into the convention. So that was relatively fast. I think that was about a half an hour to 45 minutes at most
Right.
to get inside the convention.
Right.
Then then from there, we were there was only one main entrance, right? And we have our passes already, so we didn't need to go to line up to pick up our passes. But now we had to line up to be then officially when it was 10 o'clock to then start letting people in. So then that was entering line number 3, I guess, if you count the line that we did to pick up our badges, which is pretty
Oh,
quick
right.
the first day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was some wait as well because of the fact that it wasn't 10 o'clock yet, right? So we waited, and then once it did hit 10, we're not in the front of that line. We're pretty far back. So that means everyone else that was there first will then have to trickle in. Then that was another half an hour or so before we start to move. By the time that happens, you get to the vendor, there's already lines forming at every vendor. For we're not the only people's there to have this mindset of selling first,
Right.
right? So then the real time sink begins because now you're seeing everyone's pulling out everything they have that they want to sell. And then we realized why it was so important to unsleeve everything to make sure your cards were not in binders. Um, because if you just brought in everything, including the kitchen sink, to the table, that's fine. They're happy to go through all of it with you if you want to spend that time because you did line up. But the problem was you're wasting, as a consumer, you're wasting your time sitting there just going through the stuff, waiting for the vendor to go through your things. Whereas you could have, looked around, play some games, do other stuff that's other people are doing, right? Oh, and there's a lot of free stuff that they give away there. So you miss out on an opportunity to get some free loot, right? So all said and done, the people that are selling the cards, they tend to do one of two things. One, they let the vendor start going through the collection piece by piece, and they would sit there and just go through that process, right? Which averages between half an hour to an hour, I think, per person if they had a large enough collection. Or
Yeah.
two, we saw someone that was pretty smart. I think they said they had to go to the washroom or something, and then they just left
Ran
for a
off.
good half an hour so that the vendor was still doing his thing. Um, and then he would come back later and kind of still have his cards checked out without actually leaving it there. And of course, the third one is the people actually just leave their collection, sign off on a piece of paper, which there were many pieces of paper floating around saying that this collection is theirs and that they would come back to see what the value was at a later time, whatever that may be.
Right.
Um, yeah, anything that I miss or you want to add?
Yeah, I felt like if we were lucky, it was 30 minutes for per person, but I think the average was a little bit higher. It's probably 45 to an hour per person. So to move the line up one person, right?
Yeah.
The vendor, a lot of the vendors are very well prepared. CM Games, I think, had at least, I think, almost 8 people, I want to say. Eight
Yeah, seven to
people,
eight. Seven to
7, 8
eight. Yeah.
people that were
Yeah.
just there taking literally, they're running in parallel. So they're taking like 7 people, 7 to 8 people at a time. But of course, depending on the size of each person and how much the cards that they wanted to sell, the speed will vary a little bit. But they were quite
Yeah.
fast. I mean, to be honest, right? They
Yeah.
knew what made sense or what the values of the cards were. They also had the ability to look it up on their specific systems, right? Um, but yeah, do you back to you for a bit? Do you want to talk
Yeah.
about your experience? I think you want to make sure you cover because I think we have to preempt it with the fact that we did send CM Games our lists ahead of
Oh,
time,
yeah,
so
yeah.
factor that into your
Okay.
feedback.
So after about an hour, which once again is not that long, I guess, when all said and done, it's coming up to our turn. We see all these people taking out the time that they needed to get through their collections. It's finally I was going first, and we're like, okay, we got to get ourselves ready. I said like, okay, well, you know what? Maybe what I'll do is I'm gonna just pull up the list that I sent them, the CSV file that Manabox generated. I'm gonna have it up on my phone. Now, keep in mind I'm pretty paranoid, so I also have a paper printed version as well too of all the cards and in all their boxes and all their listings. Just because in case my phone did not pull up the file, I had a paper version of it, and I was planning to, if needed, pass the paper copy to the employee that was helping so that he could look over the things. And I would have my phone to look over. So as I sat down with the once again very friendly staff member, I totally did not remember his name. I made sure, I introduced myself and I got his name at the time, but it's been, a good couple of days now, so I
Right.
don't remember. I apologize. I basically opened up my boxes and I told him these are the categories and they are all unsleeved and they're all alphabetical ordered. Um, and then he was, I think, I can't remember if he brought it up or I brought it up. I think he did. He's like, "Oh, did you already send us something ahead of time?" I'm like, "Yeah, I did." I go, my email is blah blah blah, and then he's like, "Okay, give me a second, let me look it up." And he pulled out his phone, he looked it up. "Oh yeah, I have the conversation with you here. Perfect." He goes and he's like, "Let me just take a quick look to make sure all the high value items are indeed here." And then so he quickly just looked through about 20 to 30 cards, which took him a minute. And then he was like, "Look, looks good. Everything seems to be here." And then he looked at my two or three other piles of lesser value, and he just kind of did a courtesy glance and said like, "Ah, looks about right," and gave me a smile, and he was like, "Yep, we set you a price. It seems to be still holding true. Are you good with that?" And I was like, "Sure." And then that was it. My deal was done. Like so fast compared to all the things that we saw before us, and
Right.
I was blown away by by
Oh yeah.
by how quickly that transaction happened.
The way from, because you went first because you had more cards than I did, and I think it strategically made sense because we want to make sure that you had more time to get through your cards and I had
Yeah,
slightly less. Um, and then what I, from a third person perspective, watching that transaction, I couldn't exactly hear everything because I wasn't that close, but I was, the next person in line. And from my
yeah,
perspective, it was literally like less than 5 minutes. Because imagine going to a casino, you go up to the cashier and you're just like cashing in your chips. It was like
yeah.
that length of duration. You walk up to the till or the cashier and they basically start counting your stuff and they start. I literally watched that staff member just pull out the money from wherever they store it, and he just started counting out the bills right in front
Yeah,
of you on the mat, right in piles, right.
yeah.
And I was like, my mouth dropped. I was flabbergasted. I was like, wow, they went from looking at the cards so quickly to straight to pale, and I'm thinking, wow, I hope mine is just as fast, right? Like that'd be amazing. That's literally how fast it was. And then my experience was really no different. Like I because
Oh, and I s- and,
oh,
and
go ahead.
I did say to him, if you like how I sorted my stuff, you're gonna like the next person's standing in line because he's with me. I pointed to you, and I was like, if you take him next, it's just gonna be just as quick. I told him, right, and
Yeah.
he chuckled a little bit, and just because of the amount of time that it took with me, obviously the
Right.
next person is gonna be you, so
Yeah, I
they
guess, yeah.
automatically saw you next, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. I think I said something similar, right? I think I said something like, "Oh, if you like that guy, I think you'll like this experience too," something along those lines. So we were
Oh
probably
yeah,
thinking
yeah,
about the same thing, right? And yeah,
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
it was even more funny because, of course, the same staff person, super excellent. Because I saw that you whipped out and were showing your email for confirmation. I picked up. Oh, I better have mine ready. So I sat down, like he asked me the same question, "Did you send us a list?" I'm like, "Oh yes," and here's my email. He's like, "Okay, great." He looks it up, and he's like, "Okay." And then he, like, for myself, I kept my higher value cards single sleeve, like loosely, like in loose sleeve, so they're easy to pull it out.
Yes. Yeah.
When he went through them, like only for a few he pull them out to check, but for most of them he just went through, and then again I also printed out the list for them to look over. And I think that helped a lot
Yeah.
because they just
It
literally
does.
had to see if your card that you stated was there and is on the list, and they're
Hmm.
just verifying that that list is accurate. And Plus, they've done the legwork via ascending the list ahead of time. So there's no surprises, so to speak, right? And then after you look through the higher tier cards, he basically just glanced at my mid tier and lower tier, and he just kind of like, yeah, okay, looks right. He didn't even flip through them.
Yeah.
And I was like,
right.
wow,
Yeah.
okay, there's a lot of trust there. But again, that goes to show, like, when you're willing to put in the work and show that you're not being shady and you're being upfront and transparent as much as possible, and you're trying to make their lives easy, they end up making your life easy too. It goes both ways, right? I guess that's that, unofficial respect, so to speak, right? You understand, the trade that's taking place, and you don't want to hold up each other's time. And so they're like, there's no reason to think that you would mess around. If you did this with your money, your higher tiered money cards, there's no reason why you would bother messing around with the $1, the $5 cards. Like, really?
Yeah.
Right? So therefore, he was like, yep, good. And then again, like, I think you were quick. I might have been like maybe a second quick. Again, he basically said the same thing. You okay with the price? I'm like, yep. And then laid it down. And again, I think to from what we discovered, like, and we can't say this is going to be for everyone, but for our card list, we were able to get, I think, close to, not exactly, but close to like the 70 cents to the dollar.
Yeah, and this will vary person to person,
Of
and
course.
collection to collection. I just want to state that for Card Monster, out of respect, they may not offer the exact same,
Exactly.
but it was a very like fair assessment, and
it's an average.
like I said, I don't think I think other vendors may be close, but then it was just like, once again, their responsiveness and their openness to having a conversation ahead of time definitely gave us the comfort of dealing with them.
Yeah.
So that's really where it kind of comes down to, like, making a choice of which vendor you want to go to.
Yeah. And when I say average, I don't mean average per person. I mean, it's based on your cards, number of cards, and the value, and it averages out, right? Because if you have a lot more $1 to $5 cards, right, chances are you may not be able to hit that 70 cents to $1 range. It might be on the lower or mid spectrum, right? But if you have a lot of like higher tier cards, right, or depending on what your skew is, that might help skew it back up closer to that 70% range. Because the thing is, higher value cards means they're sought after, means the resale is better, means that they can offer you closer to the 70% or 70 cents to $1 range, because they know they can sell it, right? They're not going to offer you that same range for cards that are like of lower value or bulk.
Totally.
Right. So that's what I mean when I talk about average. It's your collection's average. And we lucked out. Like, somehow it worked out that our collection, when it averaged out, it was to that value. And they literally gave us what they quoted, because that allowed us ahead of time to really figure out what range are we even talking about here? Does that make sense to us? Right. And right away we thought, wow, okay, they're straight up, like, that makes sense to us. That works. And we're not going to be greedy about this. If we got what we think is fair, then I'm not going to waste time going to another vendor, right?
Totally.
It's all about time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's not just a win for us in terms of our time saved as well, and a win for maybe the Card Monster, but also for the people in line as well too, because I think a lot of them were very happy that it was their next turn so much quicker, and they don't want to have to wait for another 30 to 40 minutes for another seat to be open for their turn to sell. And I don't know, I think this is just one of those things that we hope that maybe people would kind of think about, when whatever they're selling their collectibles. I think it is a lot of work that we put in to get ready for
hours.
I think me and you don't mind putting in this type of work, because we enjoy kind of seeing our collection and kind of seeing how things kind of progress. But it's worth it because it makes the whole transaction smoother for all parties. And I think that kind of translates to just anything that you might be having to do with another business or another person that you're doing a transaction with. If you're making that transaction a smoother process, it's in all parties' benefit to do so.
And then circling back to how happy the people in the lineup were, because you have to remember, they're standing there for at least 45 to an hour, maybe a little bit more, depending on the people ahead of them. The third, like the person right behind me that was next, he was passing out fist bumps, I think, to you and to me
Yeah.
potentially, because his jaw was on the floor. He was like, "Wow, you guys got through so fast." He was like, "Thank you very much." And we're like, "Wow, okay, yeah, no problem," right? Like
Yeah.
that level of appreciation, not having to wait forever to get to see the next, the next staff person, saves him a lot of time too. And
It
that I think
does.
that was hilarious. Like thinking back.
Yeah. It's good. I mean, everything I want to say that the whole conventions experience has been really good. Everyone that I've talked to, met like strangers, right? Don't know them. Very friendly, whether it's convention goers or
Oh yeah,
vendors.
yeah,
Everyone's very nice, and
yes.
I've heard stories of other conventions not being as so. But for as far as I can say, the Magic the Gathering community has been very good, and it's just a
Hmm.
very pleasant experience to
Yes.
be there. And I think they are starting to have people bring in more of their kids as well too. They
Oh
have
yeah.
more events and things like that that are for all ages and not just for like a older audience. One of them being like a painting area because Wizard of the Coast also owns Dungeons and Dragons. So one of the things they were doing at this event was to give out free miniatures for kids and their I guess parents to sit down and paint some figures together, which has got nothing to do with magic, but it's a good thing to kind of have additional
Oh
activities
yeah.
and also opens up other hobbies that may be related to the person that's playing magic. They may also, like myself, like to paint some stuff here and there and share that with their kids is a pretty nice touch.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. I was that on the second floor because I never saw that booth.
Yeah, yeah, it was on the second floor.
Oh,
Yeah,
gotcha,
it's a
gotcha.
little bit more out of
Must
the
have
way.
missed it.
Yeah.
One other thing I want to call out was I think you found it because I only went for one day for the convention and you went for a few more days.
Yeah.
You found a sign on one of the vendors' booths where it says, I think something like Bitcoin accepted here or
Oh
something like
yeah,
that.
that's right. I took
That
a
that
picture
was
of it. Yeah.
hilarious, and I have
Yeah.
no clue if it's this. Like, I don't think you caught which booth either. You just saw the sign. You just snapped me a
I just saw
picture.
a sign.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it made me wonder whether it was like one of the ones that we called where we were asking, hey, do you, and they said, yeah, we do, Bitcoin, right? So, but it's good to
Yeah.
see, right? The fact that out of like, I don't know how many vendors they have, probably had maybe 20 plus, right?
Yeah.
At least one had a sign up. There's a decent sized sign too, saying they accept Bitcoin and or transacted Bitcoin, and that's pretty cool. I mean, it might be just that one that we called, but hey, who knows? It's cool to see in
It's
live.
it's just good that they're advertising it as well
Yeah,
too. I think
yeah.
it is something that like you said beforehand, they're putting themselves in if they don't know what they're doing, they're putting themselves a little bit of a risk. But them actually taking that type of leap of faith, I guess, or at least trying out the technology is very positive and it's really nice to see.
Absolutely, absolutely. Was there anything else you wanted to call out,
One
or go ahead?
No, that's it for this the selling process. But I think you also wanted to talk a little bit
Mm,
about
what I what I did
what you
afterwards.
did, yeah, the proceeds, and kind
Yeah,
of like how you plan that out. I would like to hear a little more about that as
yeah,
well.
for sure, for sure. And obviously that was always, I guess, at the forefront of my thoughts because knowingly being prepared to do all the selling, obviously, ultimately would culminate into, well, okay, I'm gonna get some return on value, right? Better than
Mhm.
nothing. And then the thought was, well, what would I put it in? And to me, it was a very obvious answer.
Yeah,
Is I would put it into Bitcoin.
yeah,
Now the thing here is that the only debate I had in my mind was would I put and it wasn't like a huge amount or anything, but it is an amount regardless of how much, right? Whether I
yeah,
wanted to put it all in Bitcoin or whether I wanted to somehow split that and put a portion of it into MSTR stock. Right now, again, I'm
yes,
gonna flash that not financial advice and the full disclaimer, right?
yeah,
That's not for everyone, right? But this is something that I personally chose to put my money towards. In the end, cut to the chase, I ended up, because I was debating what ratio should I do 50-50 or what. And then at the end, I was
right,
like, you know what, forget it. I'm just going to go 50-50 because it was easiest on my mind, right? I put
hmm
50 into Bitcoin, that's nice and safe, right? And then the rest, I kind of said the other 50% I put into MSTR shares, right?
Yeah.
And it really didn't really buy that many shares, to be honest. But at least the way I saw it was kind of like one was like savings, the other one was
Yeah.
like investment, right? Like for sure,
Mhm.
like there's gonna be volatility in both, but to me, I don't really see Bitcoin's volatility as being at all negative. It's volatility to the upside, as they
Yeah.
say, right? With MSTR, there's a lot of potential growth, and they're feeling things out in the TradFi area, right? And
Yeah.
for me, that there's definitely more risk there, right? Not that it's not
Mhm.
risk free, right? There's a reason why there's a premium, right?
Yeah.
And I'm willing to accept that risk. I too believe that there is a very strong future for that company and what they're
Right.
offering in terms of what they're doing with Bitcoin, so on and so forth. So to me, it was like,
Yeah.
you know what, 50% in Bitcoin right away, the other 50% MSTR stocks, and just see what happens, right? And full disclosure, I already own both, right, in my portfolio, so to speak,
Yeah.
right? So to me, it wasn't like a new venture into, oh, I've never bought MSTR. I already have some. So
Mhm.
this is just me adding a little bit more, right? So it wasn't really
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
some big new step for me. It was just a matter of like, here's an amount. How did I want to proportion it? And I kind of thought about like, well, you know what? I do want to see, like, it's just kind of fun to look back because it would be an equal split, 50-50. And I get to watch how each performs, because you have to keep in mind, I would buy them essentially around the same time, right?
Mhm.
Within the same day or
Yeah.
so, approximately. And then I can then track, based on the date that I bought both, how each are doing respectively, right?
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
that's kind of fun in itself. Not that I really care. All of this is long term for me, anyways. I'm not a trader.
Yeah.
I'm not in a rush to cash out or anything like that. Again, these are investments, my own personal investments.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you're really just trading one type of, hobby for another, if you want to look at it that way as well. I mean, you still have your certain amount of magic,
Oh yeah,
gathering cards,
yeah.
but at the end, we both, we're having this podcast here. We both have a fair amount of interest in, Bitcoin and Bitcoin related items and things and investments and stuff like that. So
Hmm.
it's really just kind of repositioning some of your assets to another thing. And that's something that I think, I don't know if a lot of people do it or not. It's just something that seems pretty natural as well for me. Obviously I have a little bit fun with the money that uh that was not a huge amount of money, but a little bit, on the trip. Trip cost money as well. Um, Managed to save a little bit, like you said yourself. Some of it was put into, actually no, for me, all of it was put into MSTR, even though it was not that much, but a little bit
Oh yeah.
goes
Oh,
a
interesting.
long ways. And I just felt like that made most sense because it's just something that we would, first of all, at the end of the day, the cards that I have that I sold, they weren't really of any particular use at the moment for me. In the future, I think we talked about this before. WotC has a tendency to reprint stuff, so there's a
Absolutely.
chance that it would only go down. And if
Hmm.
not, well, it was time that was spent that I could probably get back another way to then rebuy the cards if I really do
Right.
truly need it. But they
Right.
were sitting there for a very long time, and I
Yeah.
know that given that if I don't need it for the last 6 months, there's a good chance I don't need it for the next 6 months either.
Right.
So
Right.
with that, there's a lot of risk of just holding on the cards, whereas maybe the risk or return in this case for other investments might prove a little bit more fruitful. And
Right.
then, but then we'll see how things go from there. So that's kind of
Exactly.
my thought point about that as well.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I mean, to your point, like those the cards are printable, right? So
Yeah,
it's synonymous
it's like
to
fiat.
fiat, right?
Yeah,
So if the company deems it worthwhile to print more because they haven't printed a bunch in a while or whatnot, then they're definitely going to do that, because they
yeah,
need to make money, right? And you can't blame them.
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
it's a company, it's a product, right? So that totally makes sense. So the market is always fluctuating in a sense in responding to whether there are more or less of these cards at any given point. And you're right. Like
Yeah,
if the company continues to exist and the game continues to be there, there's no real reason for us to think that they won't print more of a card. And again, we're only selling the ones where we have extras, right? That we saved up
yeah,
over time that we're not using. Me and you both still have a lot of other existing
yeah.
decks and cards that we do use, right? And so it's not
That's
like
right.
we totally exited. But this goes to show that in the future, if we were to again repeat this exercise,
Yeah,
we know the process, and it definitely makes things a lot more tangible. And I think even
yeah,
for our friends that went on the trip with us, they once they saw and we conveyed like our experience, they basically, they, I think they preemptively brought some cards with them to sell, but they
yeah,
didn't spend
yeah.
as much time as us in terms of doing the prep. But once they
No.
understood that our experience was really quick, they were like gung ho, and they decided to line up and sell whatever they brought, right? So that was kind of neat.
Yeah, it was good to share that with them as well, because like we all have different reasons for going. Ultimately, it was a great trip to hang out with friends and kind of do things together. That
Hmm.
was the main part of it. But in an activity that we all share amongst each other, like with each other, uh, being Magic, it just kind of allows us to share these things with them, hopefully helping them out as well too in the future.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's one of those experiences where if no one talks about it, you never really know like
Exactly.
the intricacies, I guess, to some degree.
Yeah.
Cool. Was there
All right.
anything else that you wanted to call out about the
No, I think
experience?
that pretty sums it up. Yeah, it's
Okay,
been pretty
cool.
good. It's kind of
Oh,
really good information.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I guess we'll stop it there.
Sounds good. Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks a lot.